Hannah stood at the door of her best friend Sarah's apartment, wrapped in a warm jacket. It was chilly outside, but Sarah's home always had a cozy atmosphere. When her friend opened the door, a slight smile appeared on Hannah's face. "Come in. I've already made cocoa," Sarah said warmly, inviting her inside. Their friendship was long and strong. Sarah had always been the one to support Hannah during tough times. When she broke up with her boyfriend, when work was going downhill, she often said that Hannah was like a sister to her. And that evening, nothing seemed amiss. The girls settled on the couch, watching some lighthearted comedy. Sarah laughed, periodically sipping cocoa from a large mug. Hannah, on the other hand, stared at the screen but felt strangely detached, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. It seemed to her that she was in a light haze, like the world around her was unreal, and she was merely observing everything from the sidelines. At some point, Hannah got up without saying a word and headed to the kitchen. Her movements were smooth, as if she were moving in a dream. On the kitchen table lay a knife that Sarah had apparently left behind after preparing dinner. Hannah picked it up. The blade glimmered in the dim light. At that moment, her face was expressionless, and her thoughts were empty. "Hannah, what are you doing?" Sarah called from the living room, glancing over her shoulder. Hannah silently turned with the knife in hand and slowly walked toward her friend. Her movements were strange, devoid of the usual hesitations or emotions. "What are you doing?" Sarah tried to laugh, but her voice already carried a subtle hint of anxiety. She stood up from the couch, sensing something was wrong. Sarah took a step back, but it was too late. Hannah was already close. Without a word or warning, she raised the knife and plunged it into her friend's abdomen with full force. The blade sliced through flesh with a soft crack, and a dark red stream began to flow from the tip. "Hannah!" Sarah screamed, choking on her pain. She fell to the floor, pressing her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But Hannah didn't stop. Her face was blank, her eyes empty, as if someone had turned off the light inside them. She raised the knife again and struck once more, this time in the chest. Sarah gasped, trying to escape, but every movement was slow and feeble. "Hannah, please stop," she pleaded, gasping and bleeding. Her eyes were filled with terror and confusion. Sarah cried, reaching out to her friend, searching for a glimmer of compassion in her. She grabbed Hannah's hand, but Hannah abruptly yanked it away without even looking at her. "Please, Hannah, it's me. Don't do this." These words should have stopped anyone, but not Hannah. She didn't hear. A dull silence echoed in her head. Her hands, silent and indifferent, kept striking again and again, even as Sarah could no longer muster the strength to scream. Hannah felt her friend's body convulse, but her hands involuntarily continued to deliver blow after blow. She had no control over herself. Each movement was precise and methodical, like a skilled butcher. How many times did she strike? 10? 20? Her fingers felt the resistance of flesh and bone, but she didn't stop, as if driven by something from outside. Hannah plunged the knife deeper into her friend's chest until Sarah's body went limp and slumped to the floor. In the last moment, Sarah looked into her eyes, filled with confusion and horror. Everything happened in silence, broken only by the sound of blood dripping from the knife. And finally, the emptiness in Hannah's head began to recede. She blinked and looked around as if just waking from a terrible nightmare. Her hands still gripped the knife, cold from blood. Lying on the floor was what once had been her best friend. Her chest began to heave heavily, and her fingers spasmed, releasing the knife, which fell with a dull thud into a pool of blood. "What have I done?" raced through Hannah's mind. Her heart pounded so fast it felt like it might burst. She felt her legs give way and fell to her knees before the body. A horrifying realization settled in her mind. She had killed her friend, Hannah, with her own hands. She looked at her bloodied hands and began to rub them together, as if trying to wash the blood away. But the more she rubbed, the more it felt like the blood seeped under her skin, forever becoming part of her. Her hands trembled, her teeth chattered, as if she had just plunged into icy water. It was a dream, This can't be real, Hannah pleaded with herself, shaking her head. But Sarah's body before her undeniably proved otherwise. Her hands shook so violently that Hannah barely managed to pull her phone from her pocket. Her fingers slipped across the screen, but she still managed to dial 911. When the operator answered, her voice trembled. She could hardly speak. She's dead. I killed her, Hannah said, panting from panic. Her mind refused to accept what had happened. She wanted to wake up, to have someone tell her it was just a terrible nightmare. But that didn't happen. The operator tried to calm her, asking her to stay on the line, but Hannah was already out of strength. She just sat beside her friend's body, helpless and stunned, waiting for someone to come and take her away from this horror. When the police arrived, Hannah offered no resistance. She sat in a pool of blood, like a ghost, unable to move. Her consciousness tore between reality and fantasy, and she couldn't comprehend how this had happened. They led her out of the apartment, and all she could hear were distant sounds. The voices of the police, the noise of the siren, questions to which she had no answers. The police sent Hannah for examination at the hospital, where doctors found only a few scratches on her arms and bruised, bloody knuckles. The police had already raised suspicions. Everything pointed to Hannah having deliberately and cold-bloodedly killed her friend. But the most chilling part was that Hannah herself remembered nothing. Sitting on the hospital bed, curled up in a ball, she felt a creeping fear and disgust for herself growing inside her. All she could see in her mind were Sarah's eyes, filled with terror and pain, her pleas for mercy. Hannah couldn't understand how this had happened. The last thing she remembered was a cozy evening with her friend, Coco, and laughter. But then it all seemed to cut off like an empty frame in a movie. Why had she taken the knife? Why hadn't she stopped when Sarah begged? What was wrong with her? She got up from the bed and began to pace the room, gripping her hair in her hands. A single thought echoed in her mind. You're a killer. You killed her. You're no longer human. An overwhelming despair engulfed her, making it feel like her heart would burst from the pain. One night, when the nurse left the room, Hannah smashed a glass against the sink. With trembling hands, she took a shard of glass and held it to her wrist. A quiet voice in her head whispered, "This is the only way to end it all. The only way to escape this pain. You don't deserve to live after what you've done." She pressed the shard in her hand and slowly, with trembling fingers, dragged it across her skin. A thin line of blood appeared. The pain was almost pleasurable, a brief sensation of release from the endless internal scream. She continued cutting until she fell to the floor, sinking into darkness. She was found by the nurses, who immediately called for doctors. She received a blood transfusion and her wounds were treated, although she was close to death. The police, observing her condition, began to suspect that the girl wasn't entirely in her right mind. Lieutenant Lisa Marshall, who was handling the case, couldn't shake the strange feeling. This murder was too unexpected and chaotic for the quiet and composed Hannah. Something was off. After she was saved, Hannah couldn't even bear to look at her hands, which remained covered in bandages for several days. She felt trapped in a cage of her own mind, as if she were being torn apart from the inside. She truly believed she was becoming a danger to others. After several days in the hospital, where Hannah was constantly interrogated by the police, the court decided to release her under house arrest. She faced serious charges of murdering Sarah, but her attorney managed to convince the judge that the girl did not pose a threat to society until the investigation was complete. She was allowed to return home, but under strict conditions: an electronic bracelet on her ankle, a ban on leaving the premises, and minimal contact with the outside world. The prohibition on leaving her apartment turned her home into a cramped, suffocating trap. Nightmares haunted her. Sarah's face with empty eyes, smeared blood on the floor, and a dull pounding in her temples. One evening, Hannah decided to take out the trash. Stepping into the yard, she suddenly realized her wallet was missing. As she returned to the entrance, she saw a young man holding her wallet. He smiled, extending it toward her. But in her mind, a switch flipped. Fear and aggression intertwined, erupting in an inhuman scream. "Stay away!" Hannah shouted, grabbing her pepper spray. She sprayed it directly into his face, and the guy screamed, clutching his face, crying and crawling backward. But that was just the beginning. Hannah couldn't stop. There was a large stone lying on the asphalt, heavy and cold, calling to her. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it with all her might at the guy's head. The sound of the impact was horrific, like a bone cracking, followed by a thud against the asphalt. His body convulsed, eyes wide, and then a river of blood flowed from him, soaking the ground. The guy froze, his face frozen in a mask of horror. Her foggy mind whispered, "You have to run. If they catch you, it's over." She dropped the stone, which fell to the ground, and ran to the entrance without a second thought. "I didn't want to. I just wanted to go home," she whispered, hiding her face in her hands. Her prolonged absence alerted the police officers in a patrol car nearby. "She's been out there too long," one of the officers said, and they decided to check it out. Approaching the courtyard, they saw the unconscious guy in a pool of blood. One of the officers immediately radioed in, "Injured, call 911, while one officer checked the guy's pulse. The other headed to the entrance where Hannah lived. The girl would find herself in front of the law once more, but this time, there would be no doubt that she posed a danger to society. Hannah was placed in a psychiatric clinic, where the cold concrete walls created a sense of isolation. Her new psychiatrist was a man named Steve, who seemed to know more about her than she could imagine. During their first session, as she sat on the couch, filled with anxious anticipation, she had a strange feeling that she recognized this doctor. His face seemed familiar, even though Hannah had never seen him before. Steve gradually induced Hannah into a state of hypnosis, and he began to reveal the cruel truth. "You're not guilty of those horrific murders, Hannah. I control your consciousness with the sounds I've programmed into your head," he spoke calmly, his voice sounding like an incantation. Steve continued, "I'm here for revenge. When you rejected me in school, you had no idea how much pain you caused me. Now I've come back to destroy your life." Steve's words spiraled in her mind like a burning mill, making her forget everything she knew about herself. Images that shouldn't have been surfaced in her memory. Scenes from her childhood. His face that seemed familiar but too blurred to identify. "You came back to me when your boyfriend dumped you. I just took advantage of your pain," he said, noting her vulnerability. At that moment, the door burst open, and Liz stormed into the room. She had long suspected something was off about this case, and it had been bothering her, but now she understood everything. Hannah, in a state of hypnosis, looked at the investigator with rage. "Hannah, are you here? Can you hear me?" Liz called out, observing the tense expression on her face. But Hannah didn't respond. Steve continued, "This investigator is to blame for your suffering. She came to kill you. Go ahead, Hannah. Kill her first." His words, like poisonous gas, filled Hannah's mind, crushing her will. She felt control slipping from her grasp. Then, suddenly, under the influence of forces she couldn't control, Hannah lunged at Liz. It was an involuntary movement that was beyond her consciousness. A cold shard of glass appeared in Hannah's hand, a remnant of a broken cup that had been on the table, and although her heart screamed no, her body had already acted. Liz, realizing the threat, tried to back away, but the girl, driven by hatred and panic, struck again. Hannah was fighting against herself, trying to suppress this aggression. "I don't want this. I don't want to hurt anyone." Her thoughts tangled like intertwined threads. She desperately sought to stop her hand, but the feelings of hatred and rage instilled in her by the doctor overwhelmed her. Liz attempted to defend herself, but every part of her body screamed in pain. Hannah continued to strike. Her mind seemed to crack under the pressure, but her subconscious was gaining the upper hand. "Hannah, don't do this," Liz shouted, backing away, but Hannah felt the darkness looming over her. An internal struggle flared up in her mind again. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she screamed at herself, but the voices in her head rose again, pushing her forward. Steve, watching the chaos, yelled, "Kill her now. Your life is my playground." His words rang in her ears like church bells. The girl felt the crime turning her into a monster and struggled against that impulse. But the shard of glass was already slipping from her control. When Liz tried to grab her hand, Hannah, not understanding what she was doing, struck out. The force with which she did it shocked her. The shard pierced the investigator's body, and the sensation of horror and despair washed over her like a cold wave. "No, what am I doing?" she thought, feeling the mad rage spiraling out of control. Liz, struck, fell to the floor, her gaze filled with terror. Hannah, gritting her teeth, tried to distance herself from this reality, but the voices grew louder. "It's him. It's all his fault." The thoughts echoed, and Hannah, consumed by panic, tried to quell this aggression. A ruthless battle raged in her mind. Part of her wanted to help, while the other wanted to destroy. Steve, observing the horror, only smiled. "You'll never escape your past, Hannah. You did this. You're destroying yourself." His words pierced her like poison, and at that moment, determination sparked in her head. Suddenly, as if in a last surge, Hannah released Liz. She lunged at Steve, and at the moment he began to laugh, she felt hatred fill her to the brim. "You made me a monster," she shouted, and fueled with energy, she struck him in the chest. The shard penetrated like a snake's fang, piercing his body. Steve fell to the floor, and his smile gradually transformed into a look of shock. "Oh, this is what I wanted. You killed me yourself. I didn't command it. Now you're truly a monster. A killer," he said, closing his eyes. Hannah stepped back, watching as Steve fell to the floor, his face reflecting uncontrollable satisfaction from her suffering. As soon as his body hit the ground, she felt a deep sense of guilt overwhelm her. She realized that murder had changed her forever. A void appeared in her soul, feeding a horrifying idea. "I'm truly a monster," she thought. Liz, seeing what had happened, screamed, "No, Hannah, don't do this." But words were no longer enough. Overcome with horror and despair, Hannah raised the remaining shard to her throat. Time stopped, and in that moment, she saw darkness swallowing the light. With a deep breath, despite all of Liz's pleas, she made a swift motion, cutting her own throat. Blood gushed forth, washing over everything around her, and Hannah realized she had fled from her humanity, and now it was gone. Liz, frozen in horror, tried to grasp Hannah, but it was already too late. Everything was over, and the darkness slowly pulled her into its embrace, leaving the world filled with fear and hopelessness. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next. And remember, there's something dark within each of us, but true strength lies in overcoming that darkness.